Am I audible to you? Hey, no one's responding. Oh, on. Thank you. That's good, on. I should have noticed that. Good afternoon. I'm J. Robert Lennon, the Director of Creative Writing here at Cornell, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to a new season of the Cornell English Department's reading series. I'll be introducing tonight's reader, Ron Hansen, in a few moments, but first I'd like to ask everyone to turn off your cell phones, not only to preserve the intimacy and intensity of what will certainly be a great reading, but to save yourself from the deep humiliation you will feel when everyone in this room hears the sound of mariachi music blaring from your pants. This is a humiliation that will endure. You will have it for the remainder of your days, and it will haunt your children and your children's children after them. So please power down. For those of you who are new to this series, it has been funded for more than half a decade now by two anonymous Cornell alums, to whom we are, as always, very grateful. But tonight's reading falls under the aegis of the Eamon McEneaney Memorial Reading. By now, this community is well acquainted with the life of Eamon McEneaney. But for the benefit of newcomers, I'd like to say a few words about this extraordinary writer, athlete, husband and father, Cornellian, and hero, and how this reading came to be endowed. Eamon McEneaney was a senior vice president working for Cantor Fitzgerald in New York City when he died in the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center just over 10 years ago. This alone would have earned him a place in our collective memory as a man whose life intersected both with this institution and with a tragic part of this nation's history. But McEneaney had already made history on that very site when, during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, he helped lead 63 people down 105 flights of stairs to safety. And before that brave and selfless act, McEneaney had already made Cornell history as one of the finest college lacrosse players to have played anywhere, and certainly here. He helped lead the Cornell Big Red to the NCAA Men's Lacrosse Championship in 1976 and 77, and to this date is ranked 6th all-time in Division I assists with 164, 10th in career points per game, and 18th in career points overall. He was also an All-Ivy wide receiver, and an inductee into the Cornell Sports Hall of Fame and the National Lacrosse Hall of Fame, and the NCAA's Silver Anniversary Lacrosse team. His jersey number, 10, was retired by Cornell in 2002. But the reason we're here today, the reason his friends and family have dedicated this biennial reading to his memory, is that Eamon McEneaney was also a poet and playwright, someone, in the words of our own Ken McLean, quote, whose lyrics testify to a luminescent spirit and a bottomless fount of empathy. His book of poems, A Bend in the Road, was published by Cornell University Library Press in 2004. And let me continue to quote Ken, who spoke elegantly about Eamon's poems here a few years ago. From beautiful lyrics celebrating his wife Bonnie and his children, to pithy narratives about the dispossessed, these poems, like all great poems, sing. The poems can at times be disturbing, but disturbing only in that life disturbs, that a big, provident heart such as Eamon's took on the suffering of others as his, and could not lie about the disjunctures, the nullification, the ineludible fact that love, no matter how provident, can't always save us, that life, sadly, is not always a respecter of dreams. It was because of Eamon's dedication to the literary arts that his friends and family chose to endow this reading. We'd like to thank them, as always, for bringing us together, and I would like to welcome back to Ithaca some of those who are able to join us this year, including Bonnie McEneaney, Tom and Jill Marino, Stacy Levine, and the Cornell lacrosse community, whoever of you might be out there. Everyone here who knew Eamon and is helping us to celebrate his life and work. I'd also like to remind you of two more things. First, there will be a reception upstairs in the English Lounge after the reading. Mr. Hansen will be signing books here. And there will be treats, out of which you may, if you are swift, cobble together a free meal. And I want to remind you of our interview podcast, Writers at Cornell, which you can find on iTunes. My interview with Ron Hansen has just been posted and should propagate its way to iTunes by the end of the day, if you want to listen to it. So, I'm going to talk about Ron Hansen now, our guest tonight. The novelist, short story writer, and essayist Ron Hansen was born in Omaha, Nebraska, where he attended Jesuit High School and earned a bachelor's degree in English from Creighton University. He is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, former Wallace Stegner Creative Writing Fellow at Stanford, and a Master of Arts in Spirituality, which he earned from Santa Clara University. His awards include fellowships from the Michigan Society of Fellows, the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lyndhurst Foundation, and an award in literature from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. He is presently the Gerard Manley Hopkins Professor in the Arts and Humanities at Santa Clara, where he teaches courses in writing and literature. He's also an ordained deacon in the Catholic Church. Hansen is also, of course, the author of 10 works of fiction and a collection of essays. He's particularly known for his meticulous examinations of religious experience and of the lives of historical figures. Among his best-known books are the novels Desperados, a reimagining of the story of the Dalton Gang, and The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which chronicles the life and death of the iconic outlaw, and was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. Yet An Ecstasy is about the extraordinary spiritual experiences of a cloistered Catholic nun, and Atticus, a novel about the bond of love between a father and a son who has died under mysterious circumstances, was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the PEN/Faulkner. His short story collection, Nebraska, is a widely acknowledged modern classic of the forum, and his latest novel, A Wild Surge of Guilty Passion, gives us, of all things, a cracking good jazz-age crime story. Not a noir novel, as we discussed in our interview today, but a novel that examines the real lives that help create noir fiction and film. I can highly recommend it. His contemporary, Tim O'Brien, has called him an accomplished craftsman and a superb storyteller. Patricia Hampel, writing in the New York Times Book Review, called his writing astonishingly deft and provocative. And the LA Times Book Review, in its rave of Desperados, wrote that, quote, Hansen, at his best, enables us to believe that beyond the quiet beauty of the commonplace are worlds of infinite variation, more mysterious and sometimes more threatening than our daily routines permit us to sense, except through fiction. I think it's time for me to step aside and let you hear some of that fiction. I'm delighted to give you Ron Hansen.
Thank you all for coming here. Thank you. You're Bonnie. Yeah, hi. And I'm very honored to be part of this commemoration of Eamon and of all the positive work that was done by so many people who lost their lives back then. And I'm especially flattered to be joined to a person who was not only a successful businessman, but a poet and an athlete. I wish I was a successful businessman, but I aspire to be the other two. I'm going to read some appetizers from some of my books. I'm going to read a couple sections actually, from Yet An Ecstasy, which was published in 1990. It was written, I was here in 85 to 86 and was later in Binghamton in 1989, and I wrote this when I was living in Binghamton, but also coming up to Ithaca to see Michael and Stephanie and other friends. This is actually deep in the novel. The novel concerns a young woman, Mariette Baptiste, who joins a convent in upstate New York in 1907. Shortly after she's there, she discovers that her sister has cancer. And I knew I needed to have a death scene. And so I was looking around for something to steal. And I happened to be in a doctor's office and pulled up one of those magazines, and somebody told about a game he was playing with his daughter. And I realized this would be the perfect death scene. So Mariette goes to visit her sister, Mother Celine. Exhausted, Mother Celine pushes away a dish of half-eaten food on her tray and tilts back against 4 pillows on her palliasse as she faintly smiles at Mariette. She says, I have a memory of you when you were 5 and I was just making my profession. You and Papa visited me here, and he was called away, I think. And you and I tried to pass the hour in a children's game you made up. You told me I was a princess, and I had been put inside a jail that was just 4 walls and a locked door. And I was to try and get out. I'll scream for help, I said, and a handsome prince will save me. And you said, there's no one, and you said there's no one around to hear you. Well then, I said, I'll kick at the door until it breaks. But you said, the door's made of iron, and you can pound and pound, but it won't be hurt. I'll look on the floor and find a key, I said. And you said I could indeed do that, but the key wouldn't fit the lock. And I said, you're making this so difficult, Mariette. You asked if I really and truly wanted to get out, and I told you that I did. And then you said, the jail has no ceiling, and you have wings, and you fly. Shortly after that, Mother Celine dies, and there's a funeral for her, and then I go into a new section. Moonlessness, starlessness, matins and lauds of Our Lady's office, and in silence, harried snow, creaking trees. Chill winds flute through the chimney flues. Kitchen smoke flails in the air. Empty fields shine like white satin sheets. Hard gusts zing against an iron shovel. The blood-red leaf of a poisoned sumac is freed and scutters against the shiplap on the old printery. Second rising. Window panes yelp with hard polish, and 4 or 5 sisters peer outside. Sister Pauline hovers over a flittering matchstick as she hustles down the darkened hallway, feeding the blue and yellow flame to the hallway's high, jarred candles. Sisters Ange and Sabine and St. Stanislaus huddle between horses in the stall, heating their hands on the horse flanks. Sister Genevieve pours hot water into a great tin washing bowl, and Sister Monique holds her face inside a pale blossom of steam. Henri Marriott is hunched at the kitchen table in the priest's house in round spectacles that shine like $50, haunting letters on his great black typewriter's keyboard. Each word clacks as loudly as handled dishware, but underneath he hears the house door creak wide. "Hello," he calls, and with difficulty turns around in his chair. Mariette is there just inside the door, holding a hand in a hand like a pink teacup and saucer. She falteringly walks toward him, and he sees she has no sandals on. Each foot is torn with injury. Each leaves a red print of blood on the floor. "I have no memories of that. Were you in ecstasy? Is it for me to say? Please tell us what you remember." "Midnight mass and praying in the oratory. And after that, just being in the infirmary while you were being examined." "Yes, then. When you came to me, have you heard what you said?" She holds out her blood-painted hands like a present, and she smiles crazily as she says, "Oh, look at what Jesus has done to me." It's decided that she is going to be investigated to see whether she actually has the stigmata or not, but for the time being, she's kind of kept as a prisoner in one of the hospital rooms. And this is a scene from that. Tallow candles, skin like the moon, eye sockets tinged with green, eyelids lightly fluttering in dream. The postulant's mouth is sore and cracked and welted purple by her own teeth. Sighs and caws to her slow and intricate breathing. Sister Omance is hooking and knotting lace as she primly sits on a stool in night watch. She collapses her handiwork in her lap and just stares with poignance at Mariette. She's about to get up, but pauses. She gives it some thought and gets up after all, setting her lace aside and then holding on to Mariette's left hand like a tender nurse reading a pulse. She tilts her head to fondly inspect Mariette, petting her brow and touching a dark hair away from her cheek. She hesitates for a second, and then she unwraps the torn strips of cloth from a hand that is stained as red as a dyer's. A great copper verriere is on the floor. Sister Hermance retrieves a ball sponge from the verriere and wrings it tight before softly daubing at the hand wound. She peers at it and at Mariette. She whispers, "I just have to see." And then she gently lowers Mariette's left hand until it is submerged in pink water. Blood seeps silkily from the hand wound, turning and rumpling underwater until it gradually entangles into nothing more than color. "I hope you're not angry," she says. "We're all wondering. We didn't think it would be so real." She lifts up the postulant's hand and presses it into her habit as she considers Mariette. "We aren't amazed. We thought you were different from the first." She pets Mariette's wrist and kisses a knuckle. She whispers, "We are so privileged." She holds the palm open and kisses it. "You have turned your face from me too often. You've been frightened by my affection. With reverence, Sister Amance licks the blood inside the hand wound. I have tasted you, see? Tears streak shining paths down her cheeks as she says, ever since I first met you, I have loved you more than myself. Half a minute later, she says, you know this is true. She stares at Mariette's sleep and whispers, you have been a sacrament to me. The novel goes on from there. I'm going to shift to a different novel now. This is Atticus. There were several origins to this novel. I spent a summer once in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, and all kinds of wonderful things happened there. It's a strange place because there were a lot of exiled Americans down there, and something about exile makes people go nuts, and so there were lots of strange things that happened. But one thing that happened after I left is one of the men I knew there got mad at another man who'd been needling him and punched him, and the guy hit his head on the sidewalk and died. And this guy loaded the dead body in his Volkswagen and drove off to Cuernavaca, where he was going to bury the body. And then he came to his senses and decided to return with the body and to admit his guilt. And so he was put in prison, and friends of mine went to visit him in Mexican prison, and it's much different there, as you know, in prisons. He had a maid who would bring him his food every day, and he had a trust fund of some sort supporting him. And he was always kind of an odd guy. And one of the friends who went to visit him in a jail said, I feel so sorry for you. He says, you know, you really shouldn't. I'm teaching people English here. I'm playing chess every day. My maid brings me great food. I have friends here. This may be the happiest I've been. And I thought that really animated the novel to a certain extent. But another thing that I'm going to get to is I wanted to write about the kinds of people who ended up in San Miguel de Allende, and most of them were artists of one sort or another. But I wanted, this scene begins with an experience I had in Omaha. I was coming home with my sister one twilight and looked up in the sky, and there were two suns. I had never seen that before. I actually saw it occur in a movie by Ingmar Bergman called The Passion of Anna. There were three suns in that one. But I'd never heard of it before. I called up the local news station, and they'd never heard of it either. They weren't industrious enough to go out and film it, but I thought it was a really extraordinary thing. So that's where this opening scene comes from. His name was Atticus Cody. He was 67 years old and a cattleman without cattle, the owner of 6 oil rigs and 440 acres of high plains and sandhills in Antelope County, Colorado. And Atticus was on one sock in December weather that was just above zero when he looked up at a coupling on his Lufkin oil jack and caught sight of 2 white suns in the gray winter sky. Weeds and sage were yellow against the snow, and the snow strayed over the geography as though recalling how it was to be water. And just above the nodding horsehead pump were the sun and its exact copy, like the moons of another planet. One sock champed on his wide spade bit and high stepped up from a deep patch of snow, but otherwise seemed unperplexed. Atticus squinted up at the suns and thought to himself, you have lived 67 years, and now you have seen a sundog. At 5, he did what he always did at 5. Atticus cracked the frail pane of ice on a horse-water tank and forked horse silage onto the fresh snow for pepper in one sock. He took off his yellow gloves in the tap room and shook chicken-flavored cornmeal into the house cat's tin bowl and watched as Skizik softly crunched on the floor and crunched hard pellets of food. Crows were pecking at saltine crackers that he had crushed on the kitchen porch, and flits of snow were skewing under the fluttering yard light, and a yellow taxi was heading away from the front of his white 2-story house. Atticus hurried out and yelled, "Who's there?" He heard no reply. And by the time he got to the house porch, whoever it was had disappeared. Even his shoe prints were being winnowed away. Atticus replaced the green tarpaulin that had sagged off the gas tank and engine of his old Indian motorcycle. Then he looked out at the night and a high plains landscape that was being gently simplified by the snow. His wind-burnt face was a cinnamon red. Ice was on his gray mustache like candle wax. His fair blue eyes watered with cold. Atticus picked up the frozen Denver newspaper and opened the porch door without a key. His 40-year-old son was sitting in his flight jacket on the green wingback chair inside, his hair bleached platinum and his handsome face tanned, just up from Mexico and grinning at his father's astonishment. Scott folded his hands behind his head and said with joy, "Merry Christmas." Atticus telephoned his firstborn son, but found out from Frank's wife that he was still at a budget committee hearing at the Colorado State Legislature. "You'll have to face me alone then," Scott said. Atticus just smiled and fried pork chops and hash browns in the iron skillet while his son opened a chilled bottle of California wine. Atticus tore up some red lettuce for a salad when he saw his son holding the fancy electric carving knife and heard himself say, "Don't play with that," like he was 14. At supper, Atticus talked pleasantly about family and farming and old friends who had died, the funny things that Frank's little Jennifer was saying these days, Frank's fine speech about responsibility and self-discipline to the Antelope Boys Club, Frank's informed letter to the editor in Oil and Gas Journal, the new 60-horse Ajax engine that Atticus and his older son had hauled onto one rig. Eating in silence, Scott took it all in like a hired hand, like he used to in high school when he treated their family suppers as his penance. And now he hardly spoke except to say, when asked, that he was house-sitting for friends in Quintana Roo on the Mexican Caribbean. Which town? Resurrección, 20 miles south of Cancun, 18th century mission town, tarted up for the tourists. We had a Lutheran church here by that name, Resurrection. His son smiled with familiar irritation. "You do always look for the local angle." Atticus folded his napkin as if his next question was one of indifference to him. "Who are these friends you're house-sitting for? You want their names or their occupations? Want to know if your judgment's improved since Key West? That was one guy in a house of 6 people. And he's in prison, isn't he?" His son's stare was cold as he said, "Unfortunately, these friends are halfway criminal too." "Criminal how?" "Can't say," Scott said, but he was smirking like he did in the old days when he told his father that his friends were communists or heroin addicts or fresh out of reform school. Atticus let it pass. "Are you going to stay in Mexico? Even after I've worn out my welcome?" "Well, that'd be nice for us just to know. You've moved 14 times since you got out of college." Scott said nothing but only hunkered low over his dinner plate, tipping his finger-printed wine glass by the stem. "England, New York City, Key West, that farm up in Vermont. I got a whole page for you in my address book. You left out the loony bin." Atticus took up his knife and fiercely trimmed the fat from his pork chop. Hirsch Clinic, signs for the simplest things. Today is Sunday. Sit while eating. You are in New York City. Hearing Scott tell his psychiatrist about his tries at suicide. Watching him teach finger painting. Hearing him inform his mother that the 503 on his hallway door was not an odd number, just an uneven one. "Even today," Atticus said, "we're half sick because we haven't heard from you, and you surprised us from out of the blue when it was just as likely your older brother and I would have had plans. You could have got a ride from Frank instead of hiring that taxi all that way. Was that $100 or more?" Scott held an affected white smile as he said, "I have this inheritance, you see. I have this fantastic trust fund that my father set up so you wouldn't go crazy with worry. I'd just like to see you get settled someplace. Well, I am. Well, good." Atticus pushed his dinner plate forward half a foot and carefully aligned his knife and fork across it. He had a flashback of Scott as a child in his high chair, chewing a cookie with great seriousness while he gazed out at the nothingness behind the kitchen window. "You wonder what he's thinking," he'd said. "Writing poetry these days? Nah, that was their idea. Them. Confined twice now, for 3 months each time. Atticus thought of Scotty at 8, talking to himself about the picture he was sketching with crayons on a torn grocery sack. And at 14, with his paints, Serena behind him and gently smiling, a hand as soft as sunshine in his hair. Well, then he asked, "Are you painting?" "Yes." "Sell anything?" "I just am, Dad. You've got one son who's a huge success that any father would be proud of, and you've got one son who's a slacker and using up your hard-earned cash on just getting by from week to week. Hell, I'm 40 years old. You ought to be used to me being a failure by now." Were Atticus to talk honestly, he thought, he'd say he was alone all the time, and this was his son whom he loved and ached for, and heaven was where he was. And Atticus hated himself, as he always did, for insisting and teaching and holding up standards and seeming to want Scott to be him, when all he wanted was for Scott to be happy, to know he was loved and loved and loved. I'm going to skip ahead to another book. This is Exiles. There's two narratives in Exiles. One has to do with the life of Gerard Manley Hopkins, who wrote the poem The Wreck of the Deutschland. The other is what actually happened on the wreck of the Deutschland. In December 1875, a ship leaving Bremen, Germany, was stopping off in London to pick up some more passengers and then was heading to America. On board were 5 German nuns who were kicked out of Germany by Otto von Bismarck because he wanted to get rid of the Catholic religious orders. And the 5 nuns died on board the ship. Hopkins was reading about this, and he had been in the Jesuit seminary for quite a while and had kind of given up writing poetry after writing many poems when he was at Oxford. But when he read the account of the shipwreck, he decided to write a poem for the first time in a long time. And he wrote a very long ode to the people who died in the shipwreck. It's a very difficult poem, and I never liked it much, except for the narrative parts of it. And I decided I was going to write what actually happened. By looking at the London Times and so forth, I could figure out what had happened. So this is deep into the book. The ship, the Deutschland, has run aground on a piece of an underground island, basically, called the Kentish Knock. It's outside of the Thames estuary. And it's a very rough area, not only because there are pieces of ground to run into, but because so many ships have run into those pieces of ground underneath the water that the ships themselves are causes of shipwreck. So the ship runs into this. It was way off course, and they're kind of stuck there. And for a while, the waves wash over as if the ship is another reef. Then the waves subside, and then now the waves are rising again because the tide is. And this is just one scene of what happens to these nuns. The continuous stunning shocks of crashing breakers were widening the seams and the iron skin of the ship, so that seawater filled the engine room and stokehold, dousing the coals in the furnace. The steam water pumps, in turn, were stopped, and steerage was soon flooded. The small population still holding out down there was forced to hurry to the upper decks, cluttering the first and second class corridors with themselves and their patched matchwood worldly goods. Crew hauled up hundreds of soggy canvas bags of mail and stacked them in the gangways. And as the Deutschland took on more water, it became so gravid that it could not lift on the tide, but formed its own reef for the seas to surge over. The stern was only 5 feet higher than the onrush. Everything headmost was submerged. She was tail up with an ear cocked, mate Lowenstein said. Class distinctions ended by 11 p.m., and the upper class library, music room, and main saloon became as crowded and rowdy as chilly railway stations. With the new tide surging in at a velocity of 2.5 knots, the sea seeped upward, the plush, intricate Axminster carpets squishing beneath the shoes of the stewards as they delivered the sandwiches and sweet cakes and tulip glasses of Riesling. The Deutschland was jolted again with a ram of a wave as the 5 sisters waited for rescue in the saloon, sitting on their 5 black portmanteaus in their cloaks and life vests and reciting the night prayers of the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Sister Enrico shut her Bible, and the 5 were sitting in silence, meditating on the scripture, when a runnel of seawater slithered into the saloon and widened so that surprised passengers hopped aside of its lake or jerked their shoes up from the floor. Close to midnight, Second Officer Carl Fallenhorst tilted inside the saloon and yelled, "All crew and passengers upstairs to the weather deck." The stewardess, Catherine Sloshbauer, immediately got a white napkin and waved it overhead like a tour guide as she commanded the 100 and more to leave their belongings and form up in pairs so she could conduct them in accordance with the captain's wishes. "Shall we go?" Sister Barbara asked. Sister Enrico was puzzled. "We have no choice." "We could be disobedient," Sister Norberta said, "but then we would not be good nuns." "Won't it be cold?" Sister Aurea asked. "No, it'll be hot," Sister Norberta acidly said. "Hot as Hades. You'll want a parasol and a fan." "Sister, shush," Sister Brigitte said. "Don't you shush me." "Sisters," Sister Enrico said. Sister Norberta stood beside Sister Barbara as she put on her mittens, snidely repeating, "Won't it be cold?" Sister Enrico was stationed in front of the 4 nuns and paired with the ship's doctor, Franz Bluen, who was gloved and hatted and irritatedly winding a long woolen scarf around his neck. Fallenhorst should have announced the rescue boat was here, he told her. This peremptory ordering of the whole lot of us upstairs just keeps us in suspense. So it is here? Another jolt of a wave tipped him off balance and he righted himself. "Certainly," Bluen said. She recalled queuing up like this at the School of the Holy Cross in Aachen. She just received Holy Communion, and she was praying as the Holy Cross sisters put the girls in orderly rows for their entrance into school. And high up there on the landing of a steep flight of stairs was her father, the 8th grade teacher, who smiled down at his daughter and widened his arms in welcome. Elderly Dr. Bluen gripped her elbow in a gentlemanly manner to help her up the gangway, though it was he who pawed the handrail in the struggle up the steps. Shocking cold hit them once they exited the hatchway, and there was no other vessel. Dr. Bluen was outraged. Some passengers were scurrying to the gaslit pilot house and crowding into its heated parlor. Some were in a hopeless wander or holding on to the fence around the giant funnel. A great wave boomed against the ship, and cannoning seawater that seemed high and heavy as a house hit Sister Enrico full on, joining her to its onwardness. She screamed and could hear other men and women screaming as she and they were carried on the raft of its swift, stinging journey across the width of the ship. She flailed in the last chance for the ship's railing, but she was plunged over the side of the Deutschland and into the coldest cold of water she'd ever felt. She lost all air. She lost a shoe. She could not tell up from down. She was suffering and terrified and helpless, and she could not claw up to the surface. Her black veil smothered her face. Her black cloak furled around her like the strips of burial cloths binding Lazarus in his tomb. And she could not help it. She gasped, and seawater filled her. She coughed and convulsed and took in more. Weakening and in pain, she slashed out with her hands and kicked her feet in the finality of a wild rage. But she was burdened and yoked by her habit and demanded by the sea. She remembered as she sank, Jesus wept. And now for something completely different. This is a short story that's going to appear in my collection that comes out next July. It's called My Kid's Dog, and it's actually based on a true story. This was confessed to my wife by her father just about 2 years before he died. He was an estate attorney in Pasadena, and so all this actually happened. It might be exaggerated a little bit by its author, but roughly happened. My kid's dog died. Sparky. I hated that dog. The feeling was mutual. We got off on the wrong foot, whining in his pen those first nights, my squirt gun in his face and him blinking from the water. And then the holes in the yard, the so-called accidents in the house. His nose snuffling into my Brooks Brothers trousers. Him slurping my fine Pilsner beer or sneaking bites of my Dagwood sandwich when I fell asleep on the sofa. Also, his inability to fetch, to take a joke, to find the humor in sudden air horns, to be dandled, roughhoused, or teased. And then the growling, the skulking, the snapping at my ankles, the hiding from me under the house, and literally thousands of abject refusals to obey. Like, who the hell are you? You'd have thought he was a cat. When pushed to the brink, I shouted, I'll cut your face off and show it to you. And the small-brained mammal just stared at me. But with my kids or my wife, little Foo-Foo was a changeling, tying them with the tail, the prance, the peppiness, the soft chocolate eyes, the sloppy expressions of love, the easy tricks that if I performed, I get no credit for. Oh, we understood each other all right, and I was onto him. And then at age 10, and none too soon, he kicked the bucket. You'd think that would be the end of it. End of story. But no, he had to get even. Those who have tears prepare to shed them. I was futzing with the hinges on the front yard gate on a Saturday afternoon, my tattersall shirt sleeves rolled up and my mind off in Oklahoma, when I noticed Fido in the California shade, snoozing, but for once a little wistful too, and far more serene than he usually was in my offensive presence. I tried to surprise him with my standard patriarchal shout, but it was no go. So I walked over and prodded the little guy with my wingtip. Nothing doing. And not so much as a flutter in his oddly abstracted face. Surely this was the big sleep, I thought. She who must be obeyed was at the mall provisioning, so I was safe from objection or inquiry on that account. I then made an inventory of my progeny. Buzz in the collegiate East in the realm of heart attack tuitions. Zach in the netherworld of the surf shop. Susie, my last kid, on her bike and somewhere with her cousin. Were I to bury Rover with due haste and dispatch, I could forestall the waterworks, even convince them that he'd signed up with the circus, run afoul of Cruella DeVille, anything but died. I got a green tarpaulin from the garage and laid it out on the front yard where I hesitated before using my shoe to roll Spot into his funeral shroud, then dragged him back into the Victory Garden where August's dying zucchini plants were in riot. With trusty spade, I dug his burial place, heaped earth atop him, tamped it down with satisfying warmth. I was feeling good about myself, heroic, as if miraculously compassion and charity invaded not only my bones, but my soft muscle tissues. I fixed myself a tall glass of gin and tonic and watched the first quarter of the USC football game. And then pangs of conscience assailed me. Hadn't my investigation of said demise of Precious been rather cursory? Wouldn't I myself closely cross-examine a suspect whose emotions were clouded, whose nefarious wishes were well established, whose veterinary skins were without credential? The innocence of my childhood had been spoiled with tales of Edgar Allan Poe, so it was not difficult to conjure images of Scruffy clawing through tarpaulin and earth as he fought for one last gasp of air that others could more profitably use. I trudged out to the garden with the aforementioned spade and with great lumbar strain exhumed our darling lapdog. Considering the circumstances, he seemed none the worse for wear, but I did detect a marked disinclination to respirate, which I took as a sign either of his inveterate stubbornness or of his having reached the Stygian shore. The latter seemed more likely. I heard in my fuddled head a line from the Wild Bunch, when a critically injured gunman begs his outlaw gang to finish it. And in the healing spirit of Hippocrates, I lifted high the shovel and winged it down on Harvey's head. To my relief, not a whimper issued from him. I was confident he was defunct. With care, I shrouded and buried him again, committing earth to earth and dust to dust and so on. And with sprite-like step, conveyed myself to the kitchen, where I made another gin and tonic, and in semi-prone position, settled into the game's third quarter, the fabled Trojan running attack grinding out, it would seem, another win. I was shocked awake by the impertinence of a ringing telephone, which I, with due caution, answered. It was my wife's friend, Vicky, inquiring about the pooch. For it was her assertion that Snip had fancied a taste of her son's upper calf, and without invitation or permission to do so, had partaken of same within the last 24 hours. Even while I was wondering what toxicity lurked in the child's leg, and to what extent the poison was culpably responsible for our adored pet's actionable extinction, the loss we would feel for our lifetimes, Vicky insisted that I have the dog checked out by a vet to ascertain if he had rabies. Cause of death, rabies, it seemed unlikely. Notwithstanding his surliness, there had been no Cujo-esque frothing or lunging at car windows, but my familiarity with torts has made me both careful and rather unctuous with a plaintiff, and so I assured my wife's friend that I would accede to her request. Off to the backyard again, my pace that of a woebegone trudge, but with the aforementioned implement of agriculture, I displaced the slack and loosened earth. This was getting old. With an accusatory tone, I said, "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" And I took his silence as a plea of nullo contendere. My plan, of course, was to employ the Oldsmobile 88 to transport my burden to the canine's autopsy at Dr. Romo's office just a half mile away. However, upon settling into its plush front seat, it came to my attention that Zach, he who was but a sojourner on this earth, had not thought to replenish the fuel he'd used up on his trip to the Hollywood Bowl last night. The vehicle was not in a condition of plenitude, would not ferry us farther than a block. With Buster lying the altogether on the driveway, not yet unsightly, but no calendar page, I went into the house and found an old leather suitcase in the attic, then stuffed the mud into the larger flat compartment before hefting shortcake on a spinal journey to those veterinary rooms he always shivered in. I am, as I may have implied, a man of depth, perspicacity, and nearly Olympian strength. But I found myself hauling my heavy and lifeless cargo to Dr. Romo's with a pronounced lack of vigor and resolve. The September afternoon was hot, the Pasadena streets were vacant. The entire world seemed to have found entertainment and surcease in ways that I had not. I was, in a word, in a sweaty snit, and after many panting and pain-filled stops, my spine in Quasimodo configuration, and my right arm gradually inching longer than my left, it was all I could do not to heave the suitcase containing Wonder Dog into a hallway behind the Chinese restaurant. But during our joint ordeal, I developed a grudging affection for our pet, he who had been so quick to defend my kith and kin against the noise of passing trucks, who took loud notice of the squirrels outside, who held fast in the foyer, hackles raised, fearlessly barking whenever company arrived at the front door. With him, I seemed calm, masterful, and uneccentric, the superior man that the I Ching talks so much about. Without him, I thought, I might be otherwise. I put down the suitcase to shake the ache from my fingers and subtract affliction from my back, and it was then that my final indignity came. An angel of mercy spied my plight, braked his ancient Cadillac, and got out, his facial piercings and tattoos and shoot the marble's eyes, belying the kindness and decency of his heart as he asked, "Can I help you with that suitcase?" "I can handle it." "Are you sure?" "I'm just 2 blocks away." "What the heck's in it?" he asked. And for some reason I said, a family heirloom. Wow, he said. Why don't you put it in my trunk and I'll help you with it? I got nothing better to do. Well, I did not just fall off the turnip truck. I would have been in other circumstances suspicious. But I was all too aware of the weight and worthlessness of my encumbrance, and so I granted his specified offer, hoisting the deceased into the Seville and slamming down the trunk lid. And in evidence of our fallen state, my Samaritan immediately took off without me, jeering and peeling rubber and speeding west toward Los Angeles. I could only lift my hand in a languid wave. So long, old sport. Our world being the location of penance and recrimination, it was only right that my last kid should pedal up to me on our bike just then and ask, "Daddy, what are you doing here?" Waving to a gravedigger, I thought. And then I confessed, Sparky's sudden death, the burial, not the exhumation and execution attempt, but the imputation of rabies and my arduous efforts to acquit his reputation with the pilgrimage to the vets. Susie took it in with sang-froid for a little while, but then the lip quivered and tears spilled from her gorgeous eyes. And as I held her close, she begged me to get her another dog, just like Sparky. And that was Sparky's final revenge, for I said, "Okay, honey, another dog, just like him." Thank you.
But before you ask them, I just want to remind you, we're going to go up to the lounge after the reading. If you buy a book, please bring it with you up there, and Mr. Hansen will be signing them. So, does anyone have questions for the author?
Yes, I do love dogs.
Sure. If it's something you're embarrassed about, you could ask it privately.
How was it that you decided to write the story of Jesse?
My grandfather claimed to have met Jesse James, and he was one of the few people who told me that. I heard many people who said that, but he was in the right place at the right time and the right age for it to have happened. He said he was a little kid on a farm near Adair, Iowa, and these 5 or 6 guys came up on their horses, and they just wanted water. And they were amiable enough to him, and then they heard pounding of other horse hooves, and they immediately jumped on the horses and rode off, and he never saw them again. So he thought that, and then it was revealed that there had just been a train robbery in that area. So I lived with that for a long time. I thought it was a great story. And then I was doing research on the Dalton gang, who deliberately imitated a lot of things that the James gang had done. And so I ended up learning a lot about the James gang just by reading about the Daltons. And I was asked to write a short story for Tri-Quarterly. They're doing a special issue on the Old West. And I said, okay, I'll tell you how Jesse James was killed, because nobody had gotten it right. If you read the real story, as I put it, it was very much more complicated than is usually presented. And I had about 30 pages of the short story written, and I realized there was so much more to go on, so I decided to continue with the novel. Brad Pitt, when I first wrote the novel, Brad Pitt had just appeared, I think, in Thelma and Louise. And he was a young newcomer, and I thought, wow, he'd be the perfect Bob Ford. And then so many years passed that he was now Jesse James, and I found Casey Affleck to be Bob Ford. But I was really pleased with his performance.
More?
Is the Mariette story based on an actual occurrence?
It's kind of an amalgamation of lots of different stories. There were a lot of stigmatics in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. And so I took lots of those, but it was the chief woman who influenced it was named Gemma Galgani. She was a beautiful young woman who was in a convent, had the stigmata, got kicked out of the convent several times because she was, I don't know why exactly, but so she was the chief influence, but I used parts of a lot of different stories. I had originally set in France, but I was teaching at Binghamton. I thought it was so much easier to put in upstate New York because I could just look out the window and describe what I saw. So I completed it when I was there.
We've got time for one more. Shall we proceed forth to the
Yeah.
treats?
Thank you very much.